President.
Senator from Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the privileges of the floor be granted to the following member of the Senator from Oregon staff, Elizabeth Heitzman, during the pendency of the pending business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I know the Senator from Missouri is here, and I'm going to make a unanimous consent request that I anticipate he will object on behalf of other senators. So let me do that formally and then make my comments. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, calendar 112, that the nomination be confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume a legislative session.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I object on behalf of Senator Hatch and Senator Isakson.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I certainly understand that my friend from Missouri is doing this on behalf of other senators, and I just want to express my disappointment that these senators are objecting to the confirmation of William J. Borman, an individual who is eminently qualified to be our nation's 26th public printer and head of the government printing office. President Obama nominated Bill Borman 18 months ago. The Senate Committee on Rules and Administration reported the nomination favorably in July of 2010. The nomination languished because of the Republican objections, so President Obama made a recess appointment on January 3rd, 2011, and renominated Mr. Borman on January 27th, 2011. Again, the Senate Rules Committee reported the nomination favorably by voice vote this past May. The public printer is not a controversial position. Previous printers have been confirmed without controversy or delay. This obstruction is unprecedented. Bill's career in the printing industry spans 40 years. He started as a practical printer, trained under the apprenticeship program of the International Typographical Union, and served his apprenticeship in the McArdle Printing Company in Washington, D.C. In 1974, he accepted an appointment as a journeyman printer at the GPO. Mr. Borman was elected president of his home local 10112 when he was just 30 years of age. He later served as a national officer with the ITU, where he was a key architect of the merger between the ITU and the Communication Workers of America. He was elected the ITU president shortly before the merger and has been reelected to 7 successive terms since. He has served as an unpaid consultant to several public printers and has testified before various congressional committees regarding GPO programs and policies. He's an expert in this field. He's eminently qualified. I think the members of this body know that. Mr. Borman served as chairman of the $1 billion CWA-ITU negotiated pension plan and $125 million Canadian negotiated pension plans. He has experience in management. He was among the union leaders who spearheaded the creation of the AFL-CIO Capital Stewardship Program and the Center for Working Capital in the Federation. Because of his experience in the field of pension administration, he was chosen to represent CWA on the Council of Institutional Investors, serving 12 years as a member of the Executive Board and 3 terms as its co-chairman. He's also served on the Maryland Commission on Judicial Disability and a co-chair of the Taft-Hartley Northern American Study Group Educational Investment Conference. He has served as president of the Union Printers Home, a 122-bed skilled nursing facility in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I mention his extensive background to underscore the point that Bill Borman is perhaps uniquely qualified to serve as the nation's public printer, and there's absolutely no good reason to hold up his confirmation. All we're asking, Mr. President, let's bring this nomination forward for a vote. A person who has eminent qualifications, there's no substantive objection to his confirmation. I hope my colleagues who have raised the objection will allow us to move forward. The public printer serves as the chief executive officer of the GPO, the agency charged with keeping the American people informed about the work of the federal government. GPO is one of the world's largest printing plants and digital factories and is one of the biggest printer buyers in the world. GPO disseminates the congressional record and the Federal Registry and numerous other products and services to both print and digital form. The agency has been asked to build its digital capabilities into a state-of-the-art operation to improve transparency and citizens' access to government documents and reports. We hear all the time about making this system more transparent. Mr. Boorman knows how to do that. Let's give him a confirmed position so that we can help bring the public more into what we do here in Congress. Bill Boorman faces the challenges of maintaining the traditional printing skills of an aging workforce while helping a 150-year organization adapt to the world in which most documents are born digital. As Bill has said, few federal agencies can count as their heritage the scope of the work of the GPO has performed, ranging from the first printing of the Emancipation Proclamation to providing digital access to the government publications today. The men and women at GPO are responsible for that heritage. Mr. President, it's past time that Bill Boorman, a man with over 40 years of experience in the printing industry, be considered and confirmed as the nation's 26th public printer. I urge my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle, let the Senate do what it is legally responsible to do, advise and consent on these confirmations. Let us vote so that we can confirm this position that was first brought forward over a year and a half ago. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I want to associate myself with my colleague from Maryland regarding the nomination of Mr. Foreman. My colleague from Maryland has offered a spirited and comprehensive description of why Mr. Foreman should be confirmed as our public printer. I would just like to, one, validate everything he said, and second, Mr. Foreman, we need to know, is a reformer. He has the heart of a reformer, he has the spirit of a reformer, he has the know-how of a reformer. And as we look at the position he's being asked to serve, we need someone who has technical competence in the field, experience in managing large organization, and also one who's dealt with the challenges related to both delivering a product but also those related to the workforce. I think we are doing a national disservice by not putting this man in charge so he can take charge and maintain something that is a nonpartisan job, the government printing office. It's not like he's going to be in some back room reprinting little pamphlets from the 1930s bread march. He's here to be our public printer. Now, we know we're into a new age, a digital age. He's got a lot of reform to do. We know that there's workforce reform that needs to be done, but done with sensitivity. And again, somebody who himself was from the rank and file. So I just think this, once again, we're playing politics with a job that certainly is not political. We have an esteemed, qualified individual who wants to be a reformer, to get the job done, and who knows that we are in a more frugal atmosphere. And I think we are wasting time, we are wasting money, and we are wasting the talent of an exceptional individual. And I'm going to say this, Mr. President, the more we continue to delay and be deleterious on these appointments, why would anybody want to come forth to serve in the public domain? They often have to give up jobs or put their jobs on hold while they're waiting for these confirmation processes. We put more sand in the gears of government, and then we blame government for grinding to a halt. Let's have an orderly way of dealing with confirmations and at least give the man a vote up or down, yes or no. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Acosta.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland,
I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be vacated.
without objection.
You know, Mr. President, if the American people are watching this, they'd say, what are they doing? Well, actually, we're doing a lot. Senator Blunt and I are managing a bill, and you might say, but there's nothing going on. Well, there's a lot going on because we're reviewing amendments of senators. That's what all this discussion is, to see what we could take, where there might even be bipartisan agreement, and then we're lining up how we will proceed on the next 4 to 6 amendments, again, alternating both sides of the aisle. So if people are watching, they're saying, what are they doing? Just what are they doing? Well, we are doing a lot. We hope to, by the close of business tomorrow, finish the Agriculture, Commerce, Justice, and Transportation Housing Bill appropriations. We're going to have some robust debate on some amendments. Some are quite controversial. So, but right now, we're trying to see what do we agree upon and what we don't agree upon. How could there be a regular, civilized, orderly process for having debate and then voting? We anticipate that somewhere around 5:30 or 6 o'clock, we'll have a cluster of votes. So that's kind of the game plan so far. And, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator Murkowski explaining where things stand here in the Senate, expecting votes probably around 5:30 Eastern Time, according to the senator. Lawmakers have been working on 3 appropriations bills rolled into one, which includes funding for the Agriculture, Commerce, Justice, and Transportation departments, and also Housing and Urban Development. The National Journal writing that barely a month after Senate Democrats made it known that they were irked at the White House for failing to keep congressional allies up to speed on President Obama's jobs plan, coordination looks to have improved. On Monday, the White House and Senate Majority Leader Reid coordinated messages on plans to push a piece of the bill that would provide $35 billion in state and local aid for retention of teachers and first responders. And this afternoon, Vice President Joe Biden is joining Senate Democrats to push for that same measure. We're covering the Vice President and the Democrats, and we'll have it for you in our overnight programming on C-SPAN and also at cspan.org. You can see Senators Mikulski and Blunt on the floor there. The pending business here in the Senate is what's being called a minibus that combines 3 annual spending bills. Senator Mikulski is saying a short while ago to expect votes in a few hours at about 5:30 Eastern Time. An update on the Deficit Reduction Committee. The National Journal writing that members of the Senate's Gang of 6 budget negotiating group met this morning with the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction as the panel works to meet its November 23rd deadline for agreeing to at least $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction. The Senators Saxby Chambliss,
Senator
Tom
from Maryland.
Coburn, Kent Conrad, Mike Crapo, Dick Durbin, and Mark Warner appeared before the committee.
I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be vacated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the next first-degree amendments be in order to be called up and made pending to H.R. 2112, and the substitute amendment number 738 be the following: Ayotte, number 753, Crapo, number 814, Moran, 815, Coburn, 793, Coburn, 798, DeMint, 763, DeMint, 764, Grassley, 860, Sessions, 810, Lautenberg, 836, Brown of Ohio, 874, Merkley, 879, Bingaman, 771, Gillibrand, 869, Feinstein, 855, and Menendez, 857. And further, that a motion to recommit from Senator Lee be in order, and if offered, the motion be set aside and the Senate return to the consideration of the pending amendments.
Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, this means this is now the order in which we would like to proceed. These are the amendments that both sides have agreed should be offered in this tranche or this cluster. So we say to the senators who now have these amendments, get ready to come to the floor. As I understand, Senator Kelly Ayotte will be here to offer her amendment, which will be really important. And then what we would like to do is alternate on both sides of the aisle. The gentlelady from New Hampshire will offer her amendment. We would hope then there would be a Democrat, and we'll go back and forth to be able to do that. If a senator's not here, we'll move on to the people who are here. We have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. We have 16 amendments, and we would like to finish these amendments this evening. So the more that can come and be ready to offer their amendments and offer their debate. Senators will be able to present their amendments and debate their amendments, but we would like to do that. So, Mr. President, that's the way we're going to proceed. These are the amendments. We want to alternate on both sides of the aisle. We encourage senators who have these amendments to come on over, and we will call them up. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Missouri.
I just want to join my good friend in suggesting we'd like to see our colleagues over here. We want these 3 appropriations bills are being handled on the floor. They're open to amendment. We haven't had appropriations bills on the floor of the Senate in this way in quite a while. And we'd like to get these bills done. Hopefully we can get these bills done maybe even this week and send them on over to the House to talk about these bills and their bills. 3 bills, 16 amendments, and those aren't all the amendments that we expect to be offered, but we hope these amendments are offered today in a significant number, and as the senator from Maryland said earlier, we'd expect votes on some of these amendments maybe around 6 o'clock, and between now and then look forward to a vigorous debate on as many of these as the sponsors can come and debate. But the agriculture bill that I'm the ranking member of, the transportation and housing and urban development bill that the senator represents so well, the Commerce State Justice bill are all bills that are moving forward. They're moving forward in as close to a regular process as we've had in a while, and we look forward to seeing these amendments debated this afternoon, and some of them, as many of them as possible, and voted on this afternoon and this evening. And I'd suggest there's not a quorum here at this time, Mr. President.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
I ask the call of the quorum be vacated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the senator from Missouri is right. We haven't had a regular order for some time. The leadership on both sides of the aisle has created this fantastic opportunity. We actually are following a regular order on our appropriations. We're actually following a regular order. This is our opportunity to show that we can govern, that we can have a regular order, that we can move our annual appropriations together in a well-measured, well-paced, well-debated, well-scrutinized way. And I would hope that our colleagues now, many of whom have many amendments to the bill, you know, senators have lots of opinions, and opinions sometimes get translated into amendments. But we would ask our colleagues now, let's show that we can govern. Come now, come to the floor, offer these amendments, and show that we can move three very important bills. The one affecting transportation and housing, an important part to our economy. This is a jobs bill, putting people to work, building highways and roads and housing. Agriculture, an important part of our economy. And also Commerce, Justice, and Science, which is the Innovation Committee, the Trade Committee, and the Advocacy for Justice Committee. So we look forward to these amendments and debating them. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senators Mikulski and Blunt trying to bring other senators to the floor to talk about the spending bills,
Senator from
federal
Oklahoma.
spending for 2012.
Mr. President, in a little while, I don't want to take a lot
Quorum
of time.
call is underway.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be
Without objection.
dispensed with. In a few minutes, I do want an opportunity for clarification to talk about the LRA, about the troops that have gone over to northern Uganda and surrounding areas, including Rwanda and South Sudan. But I'll wait now because I know a lot of them are going to be wanting to speak on the subject of these amendments. But I do want to mention one thing that I think is significant because no one is talking about it, and that is you've heard me talking over the years about the overregulation that is being pursued by this administration in every area and what it's costing in terms of jobs. Now, I know I talk about this quite often, but this time I'm talking about a different area of overregulation. Most of the time I talk about what the EPA is doing to destroy business in this country. I do that because I am the ranking member on the Environment and Public Works Committee. It's a committee that has jurisdiction over the environmental regulation, the EPA. And when we see what they're doing, it's something that is more serious, or at least as serious, as all of the deficits that are coming out of this administration, because it's chasing jobs overseas. And we'll talk about that, and I've talked about that before. This is a different area altogether. So we talk about the overregulation that comes from the EPA and the EPW committee where we have jurisdiction. But today, I want to mention what's going on in the USDA. In the 2008 Farm Bill, the USDA was instructed to revisit and update the marketing regulations authorized through the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921. That particular act is governed by the grain inspectors, the Packers, and the Stockyards Administration. That's referred to as GIPSA, G-I-P-S-A, and that's how I refer to it. That's all within the USDA. And the agency is supposed to regulate and deal with the marketing practices within the livestock industry. I'm from Oklahoma. That's a huge industry in my state of Oklahoma. Now, this provision of the Farm Bill was heavily debated in amendment when it was considered, and ultimately the USDA was instructed to provide regulations for a few explicit objectives. Among them were broader contract cancellation rights for livestock growers, the disclosure of the foreseeable future necessary capital investments required for contract growers within their growing contracts. The criteria for GIPSA to determine whether the producers are treated and with reasonable in preference or advantage. Now, the House has already considered this, and in fact, the House has done their ag appropriation bill. Well, several months after the Farm Bill was enacted, the one I referred to, GIPSA released its preliminary rule, and the rule they published went far beyond the requirements that were explicitly stated in the law. One of the biggest problems with the rule is that it would allow GIPSA and the USDA to punish livestock producers and buyers for engaging in practices that it considers unfair or unjust, even when there's no proof that their practices are actually harming competition within the industry. They want to do this in the name of leveling the playing field, which we hear a lot about around here. And that playing field would be between the packers and livestock producers, but really what they're doing is regulating this industry in a way that would prohibit any real innovation or differentiation among the companies in the industry. It forces a one-size-fits-all approach to running the livestock industry. For one, the new rule would require packers and stockyards to keep written documentation justifying any differentiation in price that one pays to different livestock producers. Now, can you believe this? The USDA wants stockyards to justify every pricing decision that they make. If that isn't big government, I don't know what is. The USDA would require this if they did not intend to review these documents to determine whether the stockyard provided sufficient justification. Now, when doing this, the USDA bureaucrats will have the power to punish and fine stockyards that it believes are behaving unfairly. Now, this is government determining whether they are behaving unfairly. Now, my question is this. In what other industry would this be considered acceptable or even appropriate? Can you imagine Walmart being forced to send the federal government justification for every price it negotiates with its suppliers? No. That would be ridiculous, and I think we all understand that. And the livestock industry is no different. This is America business. This is capitalism. And the individuals participating are doing so voluntarily. No one is forcing anyone to be in the livestock business, negotiating prices where some folks get higher and some folks get lower prices. Some get advantages, some get disadvantages, but it's government making that determination, and that is the way it should be. Another problem with this rule is that it would ban packer-to-packer sale of livestock. I really don't know why the USDA wants to do this, and who cares if one stockyard sells or what it buys to another. It's none of their business. Seems perfectly American to me, but this will have a particularly negative impact on my state of Oklahoma. Right now, we only have one pork packing plant of any size in my state of Oklahoma. And the next closest plants would be Iowa, Missouri, or probably Nebraska, I'm not sure. They'd be hundreds of miles away. And if packers or entities owned by packers are no longer allowed to sell hogs to other packers, it will force Oklahoma producers to ship hogs out of the state to get them to the market. Now, this would increase operating costs. It would be prohibitive. It would take them out of the market. That's what would happen. And even if Oklahoma pork producers chose to ship hogs out of state, the prohibition of packers to sell animals to other packers would force producers to incorporate a middleman to eliminate the direct sale between packers. All this would do is increase the cost of production, and that would make us, in my state of Oklahoma, less competitive. Let's keep in mind the Oklahoma pork industry only took off after the construction of a pork processing plant. In 1987, before this plant was constructed, the annual cash receipts, this is significant, Mr. President, for pork producers were $33 million. That was it. The pork processing plant was constructed in the mid-1990s and provided the necessary infrastructure to do this. However, the pork industry, the annual cash receipts have risen more than tenfold to $555 million in 2007, so making this processing plant less capable of serving the needs of Oklahoma and our pork producers will undoubtedly hurt our industry and our consumers. Unfortunately, these are only a few examples of the bad provisions of the new GIPSA rule. I've heard extensively from my livestock producers, and I'm sure everyone else from ag states has heard about the concerns that their states have for it. They believe that if this rule is finalized, it will force them to completely change the way they conduct business, and no government rule should force private business to do this, especially when the industry practices that they've developed have been very effective at safely bringing meat products to the market. Another problem with this rule is that the USDA has not publicly released the study it did to determine its economic impact, and we know why they haven't. It is really expensive. Several private studies that have been done, and one of them estimated that the rule would reduce U.S. economic activity by $14 billion and result in the loss of over 100,000 jobs. And the USDA needs to release the economic impact analysis it did, and there's no justification for their not doing it. So we have made that request. We're waiting for that to happen. And, you know, the rules and the regulations, one that particularly is bothersome to me, and in fact, there is a nominee for Secretary of Commerce, a very nice person, a fine person named John Bryson. But the reason I oppose John Bryson is that he's been very active in this whole movement on cap and trade. And we all know what that is. We've talked about it for 10 years. We had the Kyoto Convention, and we did not become a part of that. There have been several efforts to have bills on the floor to have cap and trade, supposedly to stop catastrophic greenhouse or global warming. And now people know that the science is debunked and it's not real, yet they're going ahead and doing it. Now, if the President is able to pass these regulations, it's going to be tantamount to about between $300 and $400 billion a year for people in America. Now, I would say this. There are a lot of people out there saying, well, it doesn't hurt to pass a tax increase of $300 billion if it's going to do something about global warming. Even President Obama's nominee and a choice, and now confirmed, Lisa Jackson at the EPA, has said in response to a question on the record, if we were to pass any of these bills, whether it go back and be the McCain-Lieberman bill or the Waxman-Markey bill, these cap-and-trade bills that would be giving us around a $300 to $400 billion tax increase. If that happened, would that reduce emissions? Her answer was no. And just logically, you look at it. If we do that in the United States, it's not going to change the emissions, because this isn't where the problem is. The problem is in China and India and in Mexico. So anyway, the cost of these regulations are just unbearable for our economy. And here we are with over 9% unemployment. And we're very fortunate in my state of Oklahoma because we have diversified, and our unemployment rate is down at 5.5%. But nationally, it's a disaster. So regulations are a very important part of this, and I just want to make sure, Mr. President, that we make it very clear. It's not just the regulations that come from the Environmental Protection Agency, because this regulation that we're talking about is going to be from the USDA. With that, Mr. President, I'll yield the floor unless there's no one waiting, and if there's, I'll yield the floor.
Senator, we're waiting for one of the senators to come to offer an amendment. Did you wish to speak on another subject?
I would like to, a little longer, and then I would be very happy to yield the floor to whomever comes down to offer an amendment. You just give me a signal.
Why don't you proceed?
All right, I will.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I brought anything down here with me. Well, Mr. President, I'll just do it without notes. How's that? There's a lot of confusion. A lot of people were blaming President Obama for sending 100 troops into northern Uganda. And I want to make sure everyone knows that I'm not a fan of President Obama. He's responsible for all these regulations that are driving American business out. He's responsible for the deficit. He's actually, in his 3 budgets, had deficits each year of $1.5 trillion, adding up to almost $5 trillion of deficit. And it's coming not from the Democrats, not the Republicans, not the House, not the Senate. It's coming from President Obama. But in the case of sending, and I disagreed with his position with Libya, by the way, sending our troops in there in the way that he did. Now, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, the second-ranking member, and I'm very much concerned about what's happening right now and what this president has done to our military in the reducing our capability to the extent that he has. But having said that, let me say that the criticism that he's received for sending 100 American troops into northern Uganda is not justified. And let me explain what I'm talking about. This picture here is a guy whose name is Joseph Kony. Joseph Kony is a monster. For 25 years, he's been in northern Uganda, but he's been in other countries too. Rwanda, now the new country is South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and the Congo. Those 5 countries is where he's been. This is what he does. Many people don't know about it. In fact, Rush Limbaugh the other day, 3 or 4 days ago, was commenting that nobody knows what the LRA is. That's the Lord's Resistance Army. And nobody knows. So I'm here to tell you, and tell you why those troops were sent over. It was not President Obama, it was me that did it. We passed the law requiring that to be done. Let me explain why. I've been active in Africa for many, many years. 15 years ago, I was in northern Uganda in an area called Zulu, and I found out that there's a guy up there by the name of Joseph Kony. This is Joseph Kony. He's a spiritual leader. And what he does is he goes into the villages and he abducts hundreds and thousands of young kids, usually between the ages of 11 and 14. And then he takes the girls and sends them into prostitution, but the boys he trains to be soldiers. Now, we're talking about kids, 11 to 14 years old. And so he puts them in to teach them how to use AK-47s, and when they graduate, these kids have to go back from the villages where they were abducted from and kill their siblings and kill their parents. And if they don't do it, they come back, and this is a good one right here. They come back and they have to mutilate them. Now, I just want to show you this picture first. These are all kids. See, they're holding their AK-47s and all that. Now, put up the next one, and I'll show you what happens if one of these kids comes back and he doesn't kill his parents, doesn't do as Joseph Kony said, then he mutilates the kids. And the way he does it is he cuts off their ears, cuts off their nose, cuts off their lips, cuts off their hands. This guy right here, John Ochoa, his hands were cut off, his nose is cut off, his ears are cut off. This one just went through it, and he's still bleeding. This one down here. These are kids. These are kids, 12 and 14 years old. And this is what he's been doing to thousands of kids for 25 years now. So having sympathy for that, I came back and talked to some of my colleagues here, and I said, we're going to have to do something about this. And at that time, we were not allowed to send troops in. This has nothing to do with sending combat troops into an area. Certainly, this has nothing to do with what the president did in Libya. But we passed a law that said that we can send assistance into northern Uganda and the other 4 countries. But they are specifically precluded from entering into combat. In other words, the 100 troops that went in cannot even carry a weapon. They cannot be involved by law. I put that in the law. Those words are there. So what we're doing is we're able to go in there and assist them, intelligence, and maybe loan them a helicopter or whatever they need to take this guy out or to bring him to the international court. That would probably be a better thing for him. But that's what this guy has been doing for 25 years now, and you have to go over and see it to really appreciate it. These mutilated kids, little kids. Well, anyway, I will say this, that those who are critical of me for supporting sending our troops over are ill-founded in their criticism for two reasons. First of all, we already have troops all over the world in places like Africa. In the continent of Africa, we have several thousand American troops in a program called Train and Equip. It's specifically, it's called 1206 and 1208 funding. That means that we go in into these countries and we help train the African nations so that as the squeeze takes place in the Middle East and the terrorists come down through Djibouti and the Horn of Africa and spread out through the African continent, we are building 5 African brigades. We are training them so that when something happens, as it did happen in the countries where we're currently in battle, we don't have to send our troops in because we're training them so they can take care of their own problems. That's essentially what's happening here. Now, I was in this brand new country the other day, South Sudan. We've all heard about Sudan. We've heard about Khartoum. We've been told about all the atrocities that are committed there. And it just makes you cry when you see what's happening. Well, they now have split off so that South Sudan has a separate country. I was there last week. I was the first one there in terms of members of the Senate, or just to cheer them on. And I had 25 members of parliament of this new country called South Sudan there with me for a period of 2 hours. And you know what they said, Mr. President? They said that if you really want to do something about terrorism, get this growing force that Joseph Kony has and help us take him out. Now, you might ask the question, because it was asked to me today on a talk radio show. They said, well, wait a minute. Why is it we just can't get Uganda to go in and do it, or get Congo to do it, or get Rwanda to do it? I would suggest to you that the presidents of these 3 countries came from the bush. President Museveni, he was a warrior in the bush. And he doesn't like to admit that he can't take care of one guy, one monster named Joseph Kony by himself. And the same thing is true with Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame is president of Rwanda. Remember, that was in 1994. That was when they had the genocide. And he came from the bush. He's a tough warrior. But he doesn't want to admit that he would have to have help doing that. Joe Kabila in Congo, the same thing. Well, I was able to get the 3 of them together, and they agreed that they would work together with each other, and they asked if they could have some support from the United States in the way of intelligence and maybe a helicopter or 2. And I said, yes. We passed the law, and this law that we passed was right here in the United States Senate. There was not one senator who voted against it. I had 64 co-sponsors, the largest number of co-sponsors on any bill addressing a problem in Africa in the history of this United States Senate. So we're all in accord. A lot of members are not courageous enough to tell the truth about this. A lot of them like to join this. Say, well, we're not going to send more troops over. Let me just assure you, these troops are going to go over and save lives, and they could very well be saving American lives. Because if this terrorist movement is allowed to continue, then we're going to have another terrorist movement in that part of the world that should be getting a lot of our attention. So with that, just let me repeat 2 things. First of all, we already have troops over there and training equipped. These troops will be doing that while they're over there. And secondly, there won't be one American troop in harm's way in northern Uganda, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Rwanda, or any of the other places where Joseph Kony might be leading his reign of terror. With that, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
The senator from New Hampshire.
I ask unanimous consent that the order for the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to temporarily set aside the pending amendment, and I call up my amendment 753.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The clerk will report.
Senator from New Hampshire, Ms. Ayotte, proposes an amendment numbered 753.
I ask that, with all due respect, Mr. President, that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I filed amendment number 753 to H.R. 2012, the appropriations minibus. My amendment would prohibit the use of funds for the fiscal year 2012 for the prosecution of enemy combatants in our Article III courts. This prohibition would apply to individuals who are members of al-Qaeda or affiliated terrorist groups, and who have participated in the course of planning or carrying out attacks against our country, the United States of America, or our coalition partners. In no other conflict have we treated our enemies and tried them in our civilian court system. I believe that we need to stop criminalizing this war, and that's why I have brought forward this amendment. These individuals should be treated with military custody and tried in military commissions, and that is why I've brought forward this amendment at this time. Thank you, Mr. President, and I suggest the